In his Uppsala study, Carl Linnaeus unrolled the brittle specimen sent from Martinique. The dried leaves and seed pods crumbled slightly under his fingers. Local fishermen had written of crushing the plant's roots, then scattering the pulp into tidal pools. Within minutes, fish would turn belly up, floating helplessly in the stupefied water before being gathered. Linnaeus carefully labelled the specimen with a new scientific name, Tephrosia toxicaria. The second part, toxicaria, directly acknowledged its poisonous nature. He recorded the fisherman's account in his notes, describing a tool of harvest that required no net or hook, just the tree's own hidden chemistry to command the sea. The specimen joined his vast collection, a single data point in a global catalogue of life. Yet this particular entry held a secret far more potent than its dried form suggested. For now, it was just a curiosity from a distant colony, its true chemical weaponry locked within its fibres, awaiting a future century's discovery. Decades after Linnaeus catalogued the tree, the mystery of its power moved from the Caribbean to a Parisian laboratory. In the 1890s, a French chemist named Emmanuel Geoffroy focused on the plant's gnarled roots. He crushed them, extracted their essence, and finally isolated a fine white crystalline powder. He called it rotenone, after the plant's local name, roten. Geoffroy's curiosity turned to experimentation. He placed a pinch of the powder into a sealed glass jar with a handful of beetles. The insects, moments before scrambling over each other, suddenly ceased. Their legs twitched, then went still. Within minutes, every beetle in the jar was dead, suffocated by a toxin that left no visible mark. The chemist had unlocked the plant's secret weapon. Rotenone was astonishingly potent against cold-blooded creatures, but in these small doses seemed harmless to warm-blooded animals like the lab mice he observed. This selective lethality made it a perfect candidate not for fishing, but for a new battle emerging in fields and homes across Europe, the war against insect pests. But before we continue, you need to know that YouTube suddenly decided our videos are no longer eligible to receive a share of advertising revenue. In other words, the channel continues generating advertising income for YouTube, but none of it supports the production of the documentaries themselves. Without another way to fund the channel, continuing to produce videos would simply become impossible. So instead of stopping the channel we love, and that many of you say you love watching, we created our own application to become the new source of funding for our documentaries. You can take a photo of any plant to instantly identify whether it is toxic, but also explore the interactive map showing poisonous plants reported around you, and receive alerts if you approach a toxic plant. If you enjoy gardening or walking in nature, we truly hope the app will be useful to you. Subscribing to it helps fund the production of this channel and allows us to continue making these videos. Thank you very much for your support. And now, let's return to our story. While chemists in Paris studied white crystals deep in the Amazon basin, knowledge of the poison lived in the hands of the people who had always used it. Along a slow-moving tributary, members of an indigenous community gathered around the woody stems of the timbo vine. They selected mature roots, their bark rough and fibrous, knowing these held the greatest concentration of the milky sap within. Using heavy stones, they began to pound the roots on a flat rock by the water's edge. The rhythmic thudding echoed through the humid air, pulverizing the tough fibers into a wet, fibrous pulp. As they worked, the sap seeped out, turning the mash a cloudy white. They mixed this pulp directly into the river, where it dissolved into a faint, spreading cloud that drifted downstream with the current. Within minutes, the first small fish began to twitch erratically near the surface. Their gills flared, struggling to extract oxygen from water now laced with the toxin. One by one, they lost coordination, turning belly up in a state of paralysis. The hunters waded into the shallows, collecting the stunned fish with woven baskets, a harvest made possible by a poison that suffocated its prey, leaving the flesh safe for them to eat. The knowledge that had travelled from Amazonian streams to Parisian laboratories now found its way into the hands of American farmers. By the 1930s, factories were grinding the dried roots of derris plants into a fine, reddish-brown powder. Workers filled sturdy metal tins, stamped with brand names like derris dust, sealing a natural weapon against crop-destroying insects inside each container. A farmer in a sun-baked California orchard would pry open one of those tins, the metal lid releasing a faint, earthy scent. He'd scoop the powder into a hand-cranked duster, its canvas bag bulging as he walked between rows of peach trees. With each turn of the crank, a cloud of rotenone settled onto the leaves, where potato beetles and aphids ceased their feeding almost immediately. Public health officers adopted it with equal enthusiasm, dusting the powder into the seams of clothing and bedding to eradicate body lice in crowded tenements. The compound was celebrated as a safe organic insecticide. It poisoned the respiratory systems of insects, but seemed harmless to mammals, a distinction that made it a revolutionary tool in both agriculture and disease prevention for decades. The same white powder that farmers dusted on their crops now sloshed in 50-gallon drums, strapped to the decks of aluminum motorboats. By the 1950s, fisheries managers had adopted rotenone as their weapon of choice. Their mission was not to protect crops, but to reshape entire aquatic ecosystems, to purge lakes of species they deemed undesirable. Crews in life jackets would cruise methodically across a lake's surface, their outboard motors churning the water into a froth. From the drums, they pumped a milky emulsion directly into the propeller wash, where it dispersed in a widening toxic plume. The chemical, harmless to mammals but lethal to gill breathers, began its work immediately. Within hours, the transformation was stark. Sunlight penetrated deeper into water now cleared of life. The target fish, carp or perch, floated belly up, but so did countless minnows, crayfish, and insect larvae. The lake was left temporarily sterile, a blank slate for managers to restock with their preferred sport fish, the complex consequences of that chemical reset still sinking in. After decades of observing rotenone's lethal effects in fields and lakes, the 1970s finally brought scientists to the question of how. In a quiet university laboratory, a researcher prepared a sample of fish gill tissue, fixing it for examination under the new, powerful eye of an electron microscope. The resulting image was a stark, grayscale landscape of a cell's interior. There, nestled among other structures, were the mitochondria, the tiny power plants of life. The scientist pointed to dark, crystalline clusters clinging stubbornly to their surfaces. This was rotenone, bound irreversibly. The binding acted like a key jammed in a lock. It blocked a critical enzyme complex, halting the cascade of reactions that convert oxygen into cellular energy. Without that energy, cells suffocated. For a fish, this meant its gill cells starved first, explaining the swift oxygen-deprived death observed for centuries. The sterile clarity of those rotenone-treated lakes, celebrated by fisheries managers in the 1950s, began to reveal a darker truth decades later. By the 1990s, ecologists were publishing detailed studies that mapped the poison's true reach. One landmark paper focused on a small treated lake in the American Midwest, its waters transformed into a chemical trap. Scientists waded into the shallows, their nets sweeping through water that looked pristine, but their samples told a different story. The rotenone had not stopped with the gills of the target fish. It had dissolved through the entire water column, its microscopic particles adhering to the delicate bodies of daphnia and copepods, the plankton that formed the lake's foundational food. Mayfly and dragonfly larvae, which should have been wriggling in the sediment, were absent. The poison had severed the food web at its base. For months afterward, the lake existed in a state of suspended animation, a clear blue desert where nothing grew and nothing new could arrive until the chemical finally broke down. The ecological devastation documented in those scientific papers forced a profound reckoning. By the 21st century, the once common practice of applying rotenone to waterways had been shackled by a web of stringent regulations. In a forestry office in the Pacific Northwest, a park ranger pulled a thick binder of protocols from a shelf, its pages dense with water quality thresholds and seasonal restrictions. The ranger's preparation was meticulous. He consulted flow rate charts for the specific stream, calculated the exact volume of water, and then weighed a minuscule amount of rotenone powder on a digital scale. The dose was calibrated to a few parts per billion, enough to target an invasive species, but theoretically safe for the native cutthroat trout and the stream's delicate insect life. The application itself was a controlled surgical event. Wearing protective gear, the ranger mixed the precise powder into a backpack sprayer, then walked a designated stretch of bank, releasing the milky solution in a steady, measured mist over the water's surface. It was a far cry from the drums of toxin once dumped from boats. This was poison administered by the drop under a microscope of legal oversight. The story of rotenone, however, did not end with its regulated use in rivers. In a neurology laboratory, a researcher peered through a microscope at a thin slice of mouse brain tissue. The slide was stained to reveal a specific population of neurons, those that produce the neurotransmitter dopamine. In the tissue exposed to low doses of rotenone, those cells showed clear signs of distress and degeneration. The scientists traced the invisible pathway of the poison. Rotenone, known for suffocating cells in fish, performed a similar sabotage in the brain. It slipped past cellular defenses and bound to the mitochondria inside neurons. There, it blocked the crucial energy production line, starving the delicate cells. Over months of simulated chronic exposure, the dopamine-producing neurons in a specific brain region began to wither and die. This pattern of cell death mirrored the hallmark pathology of Parkinson's disease seen in human brains. The research suggested a disturbing link. Long-term, low-level exposure to this ancient plant toxin could be an environmental risk factor, selectively damaging the very neurons whose loss leads to tremors and rigidity. The river poison had revealed a potential doorway into one of neurology's most enduring mysteries.